Welcome back. I was going through this old catalog. It's a 1958, imagine 1958 Winchester catalog. Boy, it has some prices in it, I'll tell you. $79.95 for a Model 94 carbine. And for a Model 70, let's see, Model 70 with a standard stock, $129.95 for featherweight, and $129.95 for a standard or Monte Carlo in calibers such as the 243, 257, 270, 3006, 375 H&H, 220 Swift, and 300 H&H Magnum. Well, those days, those prices are gone. Of course, you got to understand that when a Model 94 was selling for $79.95, the gentleman who was buying it was only making $40 take home a week. So it still represented a chunk of change. Nothing changes under the sun. The gun I want to talk about today is the 30-30 and the cartridge. When I'm talking about the 30-30, I'm also including too its virtual identical ballistic twin as the 32 Winchester Special, the 30 Remington, and the 32 Remington, which were rimless versions of the Winchester rimmed cartridge, and they had a rimless version to accommodate their pump and autos. So, but we're talking about virtually the same cartridge when we talk about those four different calibers. The 30-30 can't even be discussed without talking about the Model 94 Winchester and the 336 Marlin. Simply nobody ever bought a 30-30 for its ballistics. They bought the 30-30 for the gun that it went into. Hunting was, you know, in my youth, hunting was more, I would say, less specialized, more practical minded. Hunters were of a mind simply to grab their gun out of the closet and put their hat and coat on, and they just grabbed a handful of shells, and then they put this in their hands, and that was all they did. They didn't think about sighting in ahead of time. They didn't think about putting scopes on it. They didn't think about having a sling on it. They didn't think about any of that stuff. It was just simply the gun was it was like a luggage handle. They just simply they were very practical hunters. They just went in the woods, shot their deer, and then dragged it home, and that was it. They had no need for any of those things. Factories at the time, they factory sighted the guns in with these open sights for, you know, for 50 to 100 yards, and that was it. And guys brought their rifles home, and they just simply went deer hunting. They didn't even bother to see if it would shoot. They saved all their ammo for the deer they were going to shoot. It was not uncommon to see a box of ammo be depleted one round at a time, year after year, until the guy finally had to go up and buy another box 20 years later. It was very common to see that. It was a very different scene than what we often see now. Gun writers they've had their opportunity many times to attempt to assassinate the character of the 30-30. They've been doing it for years. Most of the gun writers who write about the 30-30 will berate it. They'll talk about how it's insufficient for deer, how it's barely adequate for the hunter. The ballistics are miserable. The bullet shape is not ballistically good because it has to be a flat point so it doesn't set off cartridges in the tube, you know, simultaneously, and all these things. And they get the poor guy who's reading the article worried that well, gee, maybe I shouldn't. That's the last gun I'd want to buy, or something like that, you know. Or maybe if I could just get the one that's got the scope mount on it, at least I can maybe hit something with it. So they get a contrivance that really it has nothing to do with the reason why this gun was introduced. This is why this gun was introduced, and this is why this gun was so popular for years. It's like a luggage handle. This gun here simply could be carried into the woods all day long, nonchalantly, and when it was needed, it shot the deer, and that was the end of it. Nobody ever worried about, the hunter was the last person who ever worried about the ballistic efficiency of a 30-30. The tall tales about how it was a wounder were simply exaggerations that the gun writers penned, and they made this stuff up on the basis of the fact that they maybe took the gun out to the rifle range and they started shooting it at 100 yards over a sandbag and couldn't hit anything with it. They claimed it had pie plate groups. Well, of course it had pie plate groups. Every hunter always knew that. That was minute of deer. As long as the guy could strike his deer in the lungs, he was happy with it, and that's exactly what it was for. Nobody ever presumed it was anything more than that, and the writers had they took their shots at it, and they always downplayed its role. Its role was always as an effective deer taker. Now, when you talk about the 30-30 cartridge, the 30-30 cartridge was the first American commercial cartridge to go smokeless. It was in 1894, Winchester introduced the Winchester centerfire, the 30 Winchester centerfire, and that was its designation for a great number of years on the rifle barrel, was 30 WCF, 30 Winchester centerfire. And that designation it gradually evolved into the 30-30, and for the simple reason that when Marlin took up the chambering, they didn't want to use Winchester's name. That was their arch rival, so they simply called it the 30-30 smokeless. And it used the old designation, such as the 45 caliber bullet with 70 grains of black powder, but it was never loaded with black powder, and the 30 didn't relate to black powder. It related to 30 grains of smokeless powder in those days. Now remember that smokeless powder has evolved, and there's no such loading now, but it was using that designation, which was taken from the modeling of the way cartridges were named. So that's how the name eventually evolved into the 30-30. The various features that you see on 30-30 Winchesters right now, if you find any, they can vary from having receiver sights, I should say drilled and tapped for receiver sights. This one does not have that feature. It wasn't until later on in the 50s that they started, I think it was around 1957 perhaps, that they started drilling and tapping for, say, a lineman receiver sight. Up until that time, anybody who wanted a peep sight mounted a tang sight on the back here, which is still historically, that's probably the most historically accurate, and it's also a very, very accurate type of sight because it's close to your eyeball. You're looking through a window, and the semi-buckhorn sight evolved probably in the post-war era from the full buckhorn sight. The full buckhorn sight completely obscured. It wrapped around your target and it fully obscured a deer. This is the semi-buckhorn, which only goes up virtually straight, but it still obscures a lot of target. It's got the elevator. It's got the notched elevator that raises the sights up. It comes with, I still have the hood for the front sight, but the hood for the front sight was largely, most people took it off because it obscures the target, and the configurations changed over the years. It had, at one time it had a flat barrel band on the front, so you hear flat barrel band configuration. Earlier years, up until World War II, it had longer front wood, and so you'll hear about the long wood configuration. It had crescent butt plates in its earlier days, and then it evolved into the steel butt plate, which is on this one, the steel checkered butt plate, and then eventually, and of course this is walnut. The walnut on these is somewhat you know, the classic Winchester coloring was almost it had a slight reddish tint to the stain that they used, but they were varnished. And it was, through the years, they evolved through the nickel steel receivers eventually gave way to standard steel, chrome molybdenum steel, because the nickel steel had a tendency to be difficult to blue, and as the bluing wore off, many times gunsmiths attempted to re-blue them, and it turned into a catastrophe. The coloring turned hideous. So there were all sorts of different configurations through the years. They had the so-called Eastern and Western configuration. This is the Eastern configuration. The Western configuration had a saddle ring on the side to secure it in a rifle scabbard in a saddle, and you know, that was one of the big advantages of this gun over so many others, because it was a flat-sided, very, very thin receiver, and the whole gun was very flat and thin, so it rode nicely in a scabbard without knocking your knee out of alignment. But Easterners didn't want to have that saddle ring because it clicked around all day, slap, slap, slap. It banged around, so that was left out. So they had for guns which were being shipped west of the Mississippi, they generally put a saddle ring on them, and for guns which stayed this side of the Mississippi, they left it off. So there were different configurations all through the years that, with various barrel lengths too. They had short magazine tubes, and they had longer barrels, but the one that stuck through the years was the 20-inch carbine. That was the most practical configuration. You know, when people started thinking about, you know, extending the ballistics on the gun and getting the longer barrels with the shorter magazine tubes and things, it didn't extend the range of the gun. It extended perhaps the ballistics, the theoretical paper ballistics, but it didn't really extend the practical range of the gun. You still had the same impediments of having a strapped together set of tubes that upset the vibrations of the barrel. And anybody who really was interested in shooting at longer range just got a bolt action rifle. So nobody went around. In the old days, my grandmother said, you know, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. You know, this is a deer rifle, and for a deer hunter is the guy who goes out here in these woods where, you know, your shots are taken from 15 to 30 yards away, and this is what you need. You need to have a gun which is quick to get up and point. You know, the type of sights are almost irrelevant because you're shooting at deer which is almost within pointing distance. The cartridge itself, the 30-30 or Winchester 30 WCF, is a 2,200 foot per second cartridge with a 170 grain bullet. You know, you can increase the ballistics to 150 with a 150 grain bullet. You can increase the initial velocity by 150 odd feet per second, but at the loss of tremendous sectional density. The 170 grain bullet was specifically designed to be able to penetrate properly with the velocities given this rifle. The 150 grain bullet simply doesn't have enough velocity, so therefore you really need to have the correct bullet weight for the 30-30 has always been a 170 grain bullet. The 150 grain bullet is really not useful for much of anything, except perhaps small game, and then it's very destructive. It's not the right rifle for it. Through the years, 160 grain bullets have been marketed. Hornady now has recently introduced the flex tip bullets, which they do add a considerable amount of flatness for the trajectory, because one of the large limitations on a tubular magazine is that the bullets had to be flat pointed so that they wouldn't set off the cartridge in front of them during recoil and have a chain reaction. But with this poly flex tip bullet that Hornady has been loading in some of the more recent ammunition in the last few years, This obviates that problem and allows you to shoot pointed, more ballistically efficient bullets in a rifle that couldn't do it previously. But I'll give it this: for the additional ballistic gain and the additional ballistic energy downrange, I prefer it myself. I found that it does extend the range and accuracy of this rifle considerably, but it still doesn't make it into a 200-yard rifle. I don't care what the marketing claims. There's limitations on the accuracy of this rifle, and if I'm interested in shooting, if I'm interested in taking the gun out for pronghorn, I mean, I saw the ad where, you know, a couple of guys go out and they shoot a pronghorn antelope way out there. If I'm going to do that, why am I going to bring this with me? That's rifle country where you're going to be bringing something that's suited for the purpose. You can't present game at whatever range you want them. They present themselves at whatever range that they happen to be at, and so I think that's a kind of a more marketing hype. I recommend to anybody who's, you know, a close range deer hunter who likes to go out in his deep woods, thick brush, to consider a 30-30. It's a fabulous gun for that purpose. That's what it was designed for. It carries handily. You don't have to have any extravagant sights on it. It really has. There's no point whatsoever in trying to strap a scope on a gun like this. Even the Marlin 336, flat top and all. The average guy who took it into the woods simply did not have any desire to put a scope on it. It's not that kind of gun. If you're going to buy a scope, put it on a rifle that can take advantage of that additional, optical clarity. But you're really, you know, you're hunting with a rifle which is designed for a particular purpose. This is a rifle that was designed for ease of carry, inexpensive, which they are no longer. You can't really say that they're inexpensive any longer, but they have all the attributes that are necessary for the perfect deer rifle. So my hat's off to John Browning for rifle, and that's it. Thank you. God bless.